Christmas Sealed with a Kiss. Written by P.O. Dixon. Narrated by Christina Platt. Chapter 1. Netherfield, the 27th of November, 1811. Leave it to Miss Caroline Bingley to be the last of the Netherfield party to come down to join the others in the drawing room. It was the morning after the ball, and it seemed as though only a few hours had passed since the festivities had drawn to a close. Much to the young lady's chagrin, that horrid Longbourn party was the last of all the company to leave. By a manoeuvre of Mrs. Bennet, they had to wait for their carriage a quarter of an hour after everyone else was gone. Thankfully, they would have the house to themselves, for Caroline could have no reason to expect callers that particular day. Surely not, after having entertained what seemed like half the country the night before. Having expected her brother, Charles Bingley, to be away, her attention was immediately drawn by his presence in the front of the cosy little fire. "I thought you'd be halfway to London by now." Her older sister, Mrs. Louisa Hurst, spoke before Charles had time to open his mouth. "It seems our brother has changed his mind and decided to put off his business affairs in town. I am surprised to see you up and about at this hour, sister. You could not have gotten more than 4 hours of sleep, and I know how much you cherish your beauty rest." Caroline sighed heavily. "Oh, those Bennets! I thought they would never leave. But they did leave, and if what I learned from my maid upon awakening this morning is true, it will be a long time before we have to suffer their company again." "What have you heard?" Bingley exclaimed with energy, settling himself into a nearby chair. "Why, Charles, I was of the opinion you deplored gossip." "As I most certainly do, but as you mentioned the Bennets, you must comprehend the reason my interest is piqued." "Very well, but prepare yourself to be shocked, for I understand that one of the Bennet daughters is soon to be engaged." "Caroline!" cried her sister, "do not dare keep us in suspense. Which of the 5 of them is the lucky lady?" "That is indeed the question. I only know their ridiculous cousin was overheard talking to himself. He was likely rehearsing what he planned to say when offering his hand to one of the Bennet sisters. I know not which one, but one can only assume it is Jane. Given a choice between the 5 of them, any man would be a fool to choose otherwise." Bingley bolted from his chair. "Jane!" he cried. "Surely you are mistaken. It cannot be Miss Bennet. I refuse to believe it." "Pray calm yourself, brother. I did not say it was her. I only suppose it is her. And what if it is Jane? What can that mean to you?" "How can you even seek to ask such a question? Have my own intentions toward her been so unclear?" "For heaven's sakes, Charles," the older sister cried, "are you not always falling in love with every pretty woman you meet?" "It is different with Miss Bennet. You know it is, Louisa." Caroline scoffed. "Regardless of what your intentions may or may not have been, what does it signify? You can have no reason to suspect that she suffers any meaningful affection for you, regardless of how much she smiles at you." Here Caroline looked at Bingley's friend, who had remained a silent observer to it all. "Is it not your opinion as well, Mr. Darcy? I saw the way you regarded my brother and Miss Bennet for most of the evening, with circumspect and doubt." Of late, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy had grown wary of siding with Caroline, for there was a pernicious shade in her character that he detested. At times, however, it was impossible not to agree with the young lady. This was one of those times. "I will not deny I saw no evidence that Miss Bennet's feelings were on par with Bingley's." Taken aback, upon hearing his closest friend speak this way, Bingley said, "Darcy, what are you saying? I would expect such disparagement from my sisters. They, no doubt, have their own opinions of whom I ought to marry. I rather expected differently from you." "I had no idea you were contemplating marriage, Charles," Darcy replied in his own defence. "You once said the Bennet ladies would never marry gentlemen of consequence, Mr. Darcy. It seems you were quite mistaken," said Caroline. "Who is more consequential for someone whose circumstances are such as the Bennets than the heir of the estate, even if it is Mr. Collins?" she added, her voice a mixture of gleefulness and mischief. "And if you will recall, Caroline, I said the Bennets might have uncles enough to fill all of Cheapside, and it would make no difference to me." Caroline's reference of his earliest observation of the Bennets struck a disturbing chord in Darcy. For the first time since their immediate intercourse began, a sense of panic overcame him. He remembered seeing the Bennet cousin, Mr. Collins, behaving rather peculiarly throughout the course of the evening before. He had comported himself much like a lost puppy dog, rarely straying from Miss Elizabeth Bennet's side. By now, his friend Bingley had started pacing the floor, yanking at his hair. Darcy had to resist doing the same and thereby drawing much unwanted attention away from the former unto himself. Bingley's motives Darcy understood, even if he did not necessarily agree with him, but Darcy could hardly account for his own. Regardless of what he supposed were one-sided feelings on Bingley's part, his friend certainly had the right to be disheartened if the object of his affection had agreed to marry another. But what must be his own excuse for feeling everything akin to dejection if the Bennet daughter in question turned out to be Miss Elizabeth? Were Darcy to judge by the manner of the young lady's behaviour toward him at the ball, she likely despised him. All his attempts to earn her good opinion of late had been entirely in vain. Asking her to dance the evening before had not been easy for him. Seeing in all her neighbours' eyes that same look he often espied when they looked at his friend Bingley and Miss Bennet had not been easy either, for being the object of rumour and innuendo was his abhorrence. Yet, there he had purposely stood opposite her on the dance floor, the only young lady aside from Bingley's sisters to have been seen partnering with him since his arrival in Hertfordshire so many weeks ago. And what had he done but alienate her even further by debating her regarding her budding acquaintance with the man who would be his worst enemy? Why would the possibility of Miss Elizabeth Bennet's being engaged to her cousin matter to him? Because she deserves to be happy, Darcy silently conceded to himself. If the look on her face when forced to endure her cousin's company is any sign, I am persuaded that Fool is the last man in the world who is worthy of her. "Where are you going, Charles?" Caroline exclaimed with energy, thereby pulling Darcy from his reverie. His friend was headed toward the door. "I will not stand idly by and wait to hear what is unfolding 3 miles away at Longbourn village. I'm determined to go there directly. May I count upon you to accompany me, Darcy?" Despite the ardent protests of the Bingley sisters, the 2 young men were gone directly. Chapter 2. Longbourn, earlier that same day. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a nervous mother of 5 unmarried daughters must suffer most egregiously when one of them refuses the hand of a perfectly respectable man. That is precisely what Elizabeth, the second eldest Bennet daughter, had done. She refused her cousin's hand in marriage with nary a second thought. Her aggrieved mother, Mrs. Fanny Bennet, had often derided her second-born as being the most obstinate, headstrong girl she had ever known, and now she had absolute proof. Elizabeth felt like a trapped hen. She stood there with one arm crossed over the other in subdued rage. "First, I was forced to endure that ridiculous Mr. Collins going on and on about his reasons for choosing a wife, and now my outraged mamma is going on and on about my steadfast refusal to be part of such nonsense. To what do I owe the displeasure of such an inauspicious start to my day?" Clutching a crinkled handkerchief in her hand, her face evidencing every ounce of her anguish, Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, "I suppose you think you are too good for the likes of Mr. Collins, what with your having danced with that proud Mr. Darcy last night in the Netherfield ball. Well, I will have you know that men like Mr. Darcy may dance with someone like you, but they will never marry someone like you." Elizabeth meant to escape to another part of the house in search of solitude, but to no avail. Her mother was directly on her daughter's heels. "If that is what you are thinking, you had much better accept Mr. Collins." Mrs. Bennet threw a frantic glance about the room, a room in which she had spent a fair amount of time nearly every day since her own marriage to Mr. Thomas Bennet. Unbeknown to her then was that the estate was entailed to the male line of the family. Upon learning that she needed to give birth to a son who would inherit Longbourn, else she might be thrown out in the hedgerows in the event of her husband's passing away first, the true purpose of her life became clear. As much as she did not like Mr. William Collins, a distant cousin of Mr. Bennet's and the next in line to inherit the estate, in her eyes the gentleman's estimation increased 100-fold when he arrived at Longbourn village some weeks prior, signalling his intention to choose a bride from among her daughters. The first object of the gentleman's admiration had been the eldest Bennet daughter, Jane. However, Mrs. Bennet had her heart set on an alliance between Jane and the charming young man from the north who had recently let the neighbouring estate, Mr. Charles Bingley. She, therefore, recommended that Mr. Collins set his cap on Elizabeth, who was next to Jane in age as well as in beauty. She could not have been more pleased with herself, given the speed in which the gentleman had acquiesced to her proposal and transferred all his ardent intentions toward Elizabeth. As the business of her life was marrying off her 5 daughters, Mrs. Bennet was not going to accept this unfortunate turn of events without a fight. "Then you would have this house!" Mrs. Bennet cried with more than a little passion. "We can't all go to live with Jane and Mr. Bingley at the Netherfield once Mr. Bennet is dead.
As lovely as the estate is, I would much rather live out the remainder of my days right here at Longbourn."
Despite the absurdity of her mother's assertions about Mr. Darcy's marital predilection, it was precisely such presumptuous talk as an alliance between Jane and Mr. Bingley which led Elizabeth to fear that Jane might have lost her chance for such a felicitous scheme altogether, owing to the events of the aforementioned ball. When she had sat down to supper, Elizabeth was vexed to find that her mother was talking to her friend, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, were the principal points of self-gratulation. Moreover, her mother had boasted that it was such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so advantageously must throw them in the way of other rich men. Lastly, it was so pleasant at her time of life to be able to consign her single daughters to the care of their sister that she might not be obliged to go into company more than she liked. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing that there was no chance of it. In vain did Elizabeth endeavour to check the rapidity of her mother's words, or persuade her to describe her felicity in a less audible whisper, for, to her inexpressible vexation, she could perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite them. If only her mother had not been so deliberate, so blatantly intent on giving offence. But, alas, she would not be deterred. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical.
"What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him?"
Mrs. Bennet had openly opined.
"I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear."
When prevailed on by Lady Lucas to speak lower, and further asked what advantage could be to offend Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth's mother persisted. Nothing that Elizabeth could say had any influence. Her mother would talk of her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded, for though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. Elizabeth was sure she would not soon forget the expression on the gentleman's face as it changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. She feared how he might exact his revenge on her family for such an overt slight, perhaps by going so far as to poison his friend's mind against Jane. Her mother's unnecessary admonishment that a man like Mr. Darcy would never marry someone of her ilk, despite having singled her out as the only woman from Hertfordshire to stand opposite him on the dance floor, could not help but intrude. Aside from the fact that he was already engaged to be married to his cousin, he was the last man in the world whom she could be prevailed on to marry. Well, the second to last, for she was sure she would marry Mr. Darcy in an instant if forced to choose between him and Mr. Collins. If not for the fact that she had learned of Mr. Darcy's engagement from someone whom she held in high esteem, Elizabeth would have enlightened her mother in that regard, thereby relieving the latter of any such misapprehensions where Elizabeth's reason for rejecting Mr. Collins's hand was concerned. Instead, she remained silent, knowing her mother would soon exhaust herself on the topic of Mr. Collins, and Elizabeth would be free to go about the rest of her day in peace.
"Already Mr. Collins is beginning to waver," Mrs. Bennet lamented, "citing your headstrong and foolish bent. Who could blame him after witnessing such an appalling and disrespectful exhibition? Who among us would seek to be miserable? You must convince him that you are indeed capable of contributing to the felicity he covets. There will be plenty of time for you to make him miserable after the two of you are married."
All at once, there arose a great fuss just outside the door. Elizabeth exhaled in relief when her sisters burst into the room, determined to find out what had happened. They had seen Mr. Collins walking about outside looking stupid, nothing at all like a man who was newly engaged to be married. No doubt sensing her dearest sister's distress, the eldest daughter, Jane, raced to Elizabeth's side and embraced her. One look at their mother's face told everyone all they needed to know. A menacing look from Mrs. Bennet sent all the girls, save Elizabeth, scurrying from the room. Even Jane was not immune to her mother's ire. Mrs. Bennet promptly resumed where she had left off before they were interrupted. At length, her frustration having reached its peak, Mrs. Bennet seized Elizabeth by the arm.
"Are you listening to me, child?"
Mr. Bennet walked into the room in the midst of things. Seeing what was unfolding, he asked his wife what all the fuss was about. His lady released her daughter's arm and hurried instantly to her husband's side.
"There you are, Mr. Bennet. We are all in an uproar. I demand your immediate assistance."
An uproar, you say? What do you expect me to do? Far be it from me to get in the way of two women in the throes of a heated debate, which appears to be the case before me.
"Why, you must make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him, and if you do not make haste, he will change his mind and not have her."
Mr. Bennet fixed his eyes on his wife's face with a calm unconcern which was not in the least altered by her speech. "I have not the pleasure of understanding you," said he. "Of what are you speaking?"
"Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie. He offered her his hand in marriage, just as I had expected, even encouraged him to do. However, Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say that he will not have Lizzie."
"And what am I to do on the occasion? It seems a hopeless business."
"Speak to Lizzie about it yourself. Tell her that you insist upon her marrying him. Stress upon her what her duty is to this family."
He then fixed his eyes on his daughter. "Is this true? Has my cousin proposed to you?" Elizabeth nodded.
"Unfortunately, yes."
"So, I am to understand that you have refused an offer of marriage from the heir of Longbourn?"
"I have, sir,"
she replied, silently hoping and even praying her father would take her side. She was, after all, his favourite. Surely he would not forsake her. He did not. He could not. He would not do his wife's bidding. To Mrs. Bennet's insistence that she would never speak to Elizabeth again if she did not marry Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet responded that he would never speak to Elizabeth again if she did. It was enough said. Elizabeth went to him instantly, kissed him, and thanked him for his goodness. Elizabeth looked at her mother. She saw in Mrs. Bennet's face all she needed to know, and dread.
"No doubt I have not heard the last of this."
Chapter 3.
Oh, where did Mr. Collins run off to?"
Such was the question posed by Mrs. Bennet as she peered outside the window. Soon enough, she caught a glimpse of two striking figures headed that way. The last thing she expected to see was the charming Mr. Bingley enter the paddock that day. Mr. Bingley was supposed to be headed to London on business. The last thing she wanted to see was his proud friend walking along beside him.
"What on earth is that horrid man thinking in coming here this morning when we are in the midst of such turmoil?" Mrs. Bennet asked. "Who's coming?" the youngest Bennet daughter, Lydia, asked.
She was by her mother's side before the lady could speak, as was her sister Kitty.
"Jane!"
Lydia exclaimed without tearing her eyes away from the window.
"It is Mr. Bingley!"
"Mr. Bingley?" Elizabeth asked, coming to her feet. She too headed to the window.
"I thought he was meant to be in town."
"So did I," said Jane, setting her sewing aside. Elizabeth turned toward her sister with a happy smile. Jane's angelic countenance did nothing to reveal her sentiments, but Elizabeth knew instinctively how delighted her sister must be.
"Well, Mr. Bingley is always welcome here,"
cried Mrs. Bennet, turning away from the window with a jerk.
"But I cannot say the same of his friend."
A wave of disappointment washed over Elizabeth in hearing this. For Jane's sake, of course. Surely Mr. Bingley would be put off by anyone who had a habit of slighting his closest friend.
"There is nothing to be done about it now,"
Mrs. Bennet asserted as she and her daughters started tidying the room.
"As he is Mr. Bingley's friend, we must force ourselves to tolerate his company, I suppose."
Minutes later, the two gentlemen were shown into the parlour where the Longbourn ladies were assembled, ostensibly engaged in sewing, reading, and other less rigorous pursuits. All at once, the Bennet ladies arose to their feet, and upon greeting one another in the usual way, a lively discussion of the gaieties from the evening before ensued with the guests. No one expected Mr. Darcy to have a meaningful share in the conversation. The gentlemen did not disappoint. However, at times, even Mr. Bingley's manner was reserved. His eyes were very often fixed on the door.
"Pray, Mr. Bingley, are you looking for someone?"
Mrs. Bennet asked. "Pardon me, madam. I suppose I expected to see your house guest, Mr. Collins, with all of you."
"Who cares one fig about Mr. Collins?"
Lydia inquired, thus earning a rebuking glare from her mother. Lydia would not be deterred.
Have you not heard the news?
Lydia! Cried Mrs. Bennet, Jane, and even Elizabeth in unison.
I do not know why we ought to pretend what happened today is a great secret. You see, Mr. Bingley, Mr. Collins offered his hand in marriage to my sister this morning.
The gentleman's face turned red. Is that true, Miss Bennet? He questioned, his voice pained.
It wasn't Jane whom he asked to marry. No, she is quite safe from that odious man. It was Lizzie, and just so you know, Lizzie refused him, and in no uncertain terms, just as I would have done as well as either of my sisters. None of us can stand him.
No, hush, child, Mrs. Bennet scolded. The relief that spread over Bingley's face upon hearing this was evident for all to see. Elizabeth was especially pleased, for now she was sure Mr. Bingley held her elder sister in the highest esteem. Her mother had not ruined Jane's prospects at all, despite her appalling behaviour at supper the evening before. All Elizabeth's worrying had been for naught, and her happiness was all but complete. And, if Elizabeth had been looking at Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy, then she would have seen what might best be described as admiration in his dark and brooding eyes. Admiration directed solely at her. Chapter 4. Something must be done. Wanting to get rid of the pall that Lydia's announcement had cast over the room, Mrs. Bennet concocted what she supposed was the perfect scheme to give Jane and Mr. Bingley some time alone. Steady to her purpose, she had tried her best to ignore Elizabeth, but now it was absolutely necessary to ask for her help. Her first object, however, was her eldest.
Jane, my dear, she began, I require your assistance this afternoon.
What is it, Mamma?
I have an errand in Meryton, but I am far too busy to be away from Longbourn. I shall require you to go in my stead.
The younger Bennet daughters loved nothing more than walking to Meryton, and thus they begged their mother to allow them to go instead of Jane. Mrs. Bennet would not hear of it.
Nonsense! This errand is much too important. I only trust Jane to carry it out. I am certain Mr. Bingley will not mind accompanying her. Is that not true, sir?
Bingley, whose eyes had been fixed on Jane since learning she was not engaged, swallowed. It shall be my pleasure to accompany Miss Bennet to Meryton.
Excellent. And Lizzie, you must go with Jane and Mr. Bingley as well. Surely, if Mr. Darcy was so inclined to dance with you at the ball, then he will not object to walking with you to Meryton.
Here she threw a quick glance at the gentleman.
Pray, I do not presume too much, sir?
At least her mother had tried at being civil toward the other guest, even though she was indeed presumptuous, Elizabeth thought. I am at your service, madam, Mr. Darcy replied in a manner which marked a degree of deference he had never shown the lady before. Even she could not find fault with his manners.
Very well, Mrs. Bennet replied. Jane, Lizzie, if you two will come with me, I shall give you all the details.
When enough distance existed between the two couples, Elizabeth seized the chance to speak on the subject uppermost in her mind. I suppose I ought to thank you for your civility in calling upon Longbourn, in light of what happened at supper last night. In truth, I wondered if I would ever see you and your friend again. I'm sure you might easily have persuaded Mr. Bingley to stay away if you had wished. I will not deny that I was quite taken aback by what I perceived as a rather uncouth diatribe on your mother's part, but you owe me no apology. It seems she was more in tune with the goings-on in Bingley's heart than I was.
What are you saying, sir?
Nothing would have prevented him from coming. He was more than a little distraught over the prospect that Mr. Collins may have proposed to Miss Bennet.
Then, are you saying you are not opposed to the prospect of an alliance between my sister and your friend?
While I firmly oppose rashness on anyone's part, I cannot fault Bingley for acting in accordance with that which he feels is best for himself.
Sir, I cannot tell you what a relief it is to me to hear you speak this way. My sister Jane has often been criticised for keeping her sentiments at bay. She rarely shows her true feelings to anyone, even me. One would scarcely be faulted for believing her to be indifferent, but I know with all my heart that she cares deeply for Mr. Bingley.
I thank you for telling me that. I fear I may have been a bit hasty in forming my initial opinion of your family. That you would reject the hand of the heir of your father's estate with little to no retribution against you speaks volumes. Oh, if only he knew how Elizabeth had suffered and would likely continue to suffer untold chastisement from her mother as a consequence of her actions. Now was not the time to enlighten him. Are you saying that we Bennets are not such a mercenary lot after all, Mr. Darcy? As though taken aback, the best the gentleman could manage was a baffled expression. Finally, after having sought and found his voice, he began, Elizabeth interrupted. For heaven's sake, sir, I am merely teasing you. You really do not like being laughed at, do you? Something tells me that it is a fault in my character that I must learn to overcome if I am to spend as much time in company with you as I anticipate, Miss Elizabeth. Just how much time do you plan to spend here in Hertfordshire, sir? The Christmas season is fast approaching. I suppose you mean to travel to Derbyshire or Kent, perhaps? As for the former, no. Christmases in Derbyshire are not so joyful as they were when my father was alive, Mr. Darcy replied. As for the latter, I do not know why I would. Aside from the fact that your Aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh resides in Kent along with your cousin, Miss Anderburgh? Darcy stopped, obliging Elizabeth to do the same. Excuse me, but why do I suspect you are about to refer to Anne as being anything other than my cousin? With whom have you been speaking, or do I even need to ask? Mr. Darcy inquired, his brow arched in expectation along with a hint of vexation. Elizabeth knew that look all too well. Pray, you are not about to embark on a lecture about Mr. Wickham. If you recall, your first such lecture did not bode well for either of us. That was quite an understatement. Their heated debate on the dance floor was not something she would soon forget. Would the two of them always be at odds with each other? Only to the extent of advising you not to believe everything that man says. Well, as you are the first to speak of him, I must confess that he has spoken to me of his misfortunes. His misfortunes indeed. No doubt he attributes his lot in life to injustices inflicted on him at my hands. Do you deny that you... Here Elizabeth forced herself to bite her tongue. There was only one reason she and Mr. Darcy were walking together, and that being to act as chaperones for Jane and Bingley. She could tolerate the proud gentleman's company on 1,000 such walks, if that was what it would take to contribute to Jane's future felicity. Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth began, I believe any further discussion between the two of us that involves the topic of Mr. Wickham will serve no one's interest. I know how much you dislike him. And I know how much you like him, as much as it pains me to say. My solace is knowing you will not always feel this way. That gentleman has never failed to disappoint. It is only a matter of time. Well then, Mr. Darcy, I suppose that is yet another reason for your remaining here in Hertfordshire. In addition to being of service to Mr. Bingley, you may also protect us all from the evil Mr. Wickham. I do like to be of service to my friends, Miss Elizabeth. Friends, Mr. Darcy? Am I to consider myself among such lofty connections of yours? Despite what you may or may not think of me, I have long admired you. I appreciate your wit, your lively spirits, as well as your compassion toward others. I have enjoyed getting better acquainted with you since my arrival in Hertfordshire. Surely you did not always admire me. You are aware, are you not, that I overheard you telling Mr. Bingley that I was tolerable? I believe you concluded by stating that I was not handsome enough to tempt you. Mr. Darcy drew a deep breath. How unfortunate that you overheard me speaking so carelessly. Allow me to make amends, for, in truth, it was not long after I began to know you better that I began to consider you as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. The long, eventful day was, at length, drawing to a close. Indeed, by now most of the family had been nestled all snug in their beds for some time, after having spent the night before at the ball. The two eldest sisters, however, were wide awake, recounting the events of the day. My dearest Lizzie, Jane said, as much as I relish spending time with Mr. Bingley away from Longbourn, I do not know that I can bear the anguish of your being prevailed on by my mother to walk with Mr. Darcy. I could not help but detect that the two of you seem to have been engaged in a rather heated debate earlier, not too dissimilar from how you two behaved at the ball. Jane, you are so very good to worry about Mr. Darcy and me. Let me assure you there is no cause for alarm. I beg to differ. It looked as though the two of you hate each other. No, Jane. I dare say we do not hate each other. In fact,
Our feelings are almost the opposite of hate, Elizabeth teased. Lizzie, please be serious. Almost the opposite? What does that even mean? As well you know, Jane, I have long supposed that Mr. Darcy hated everyone whom he deemed beneath him in circumstances, but I have come to reconsider my stance. Why, you will never guess what he told me. Pray tell, Jane insisted. First, he apologised for his careless remark at the assembly about my not being handsome enough to tempt him. He went on to say he considers me one of the handsomest women of his acquaintance. With such good taste as that, how awful can he be? I stand by my original contention that Mr. Darcy is not awful at all. I'm glad you recognise it too. Perhaps if I possessed an ounce of your goodness, I would have recognised it sooner. But it is never too late to learn from one's mistakes. Oh, Lizzie, I am so happy for you. Elizabeth held up her hand. No, Jane. This is certainly no cause for such felicitations. As I said, Mr. Darcy and I almost do not hate each other. This is hardly cause for celebration. We both know the opposite of hate is love, so I shall posit your meaning of almost the opposite of hate as almost love. Pray do not, my dearest Jane. One matchmaker in the household is quite enough. But if you were to one day fall in love with Mr. Darcy, you will have my wholehearted blessing. I shall bear that in mind. Here the sisters embraced. Elizabeth said, Now, enough talk about me and Mr. Darcy, and what the future may or may not hold for the two of us. I want to know everything that was discussed between you and your Mr. Bingley earlier. The sisters talked and reminisced and laughed and smiled well into the night, and at length they drifted off to sleep, each wondering what the next day would bring. Would Mr. Darcy indeed accompany Mr. Bingley when the latter called on Longbourn again? If so, would he be just as agreeable as he had proven himself capable of being that day? Such was the nature of the silent questions dancing in Elizabeth's head. She could hardly wait to find out. Chapter 5. What has the world become? Such was the question on Elizabeth's busy mind. No one was more surprised than Elizabeth to learn that Mr. Collins had prevailed on her intimate friend Charlotte Lucas to be his bride. Charlotte, as the wife of Mr. Collins, is a most humiliating picture. Elizabeth was still reeling from the news as she walked along beside Mr. Darcy that day. This time her mother had suggested that Jane show Mr. Bingley the view from Oakham Mount. It was such a crisp, clear autumn day, ideally suited for such an excursion. What a shame if they were to waste it by being indoors. It went without saying that Elizabeth must go with them. What else was to be done about Bingley's friend? You are rather taciturn today, Miss Elizabeth. Pray, your mother's insistence that you do your best to keep me out of Mr. Bingley's way is not the cause, Mr. Darcy said after bestowing any number of sidelong glances her way. Are my mother's shenanigans that obvious? Elizabeth asked. I do not mind one bit. That is to say, so long as you do not. But I am concerned about your reticence this morning. Well, sir, I assure you my reticence has nothing to do with my walking with you. I am afraid I received some disturbing news concerning my friend Charlotte. Oh? Is this something you wish to talk about? Or does it involve secret affairs that ought best to be discussed between intimate friends? If it is a secret, it will not be one for very long, especially once my mother hears of it. Pardon me? You see, sir, my friend Charlotte is engaged. She is engaged to be married to Mr. Collins. Seeing that his friend Bingley and Jane had paused up ahead in the lane, Mr. Darcy silently coaxed Elizabeth to do likewise. I can see why you would be bothered, given recent events. Bothered is hardly the word I would choose to describe my feelings. Indeed, I have no words. Certainly none she would wish to voice aloud. Despite her disappointment, Elizabeth suffered a strong sense of loyalty to her friend. A pining about Charlotte's poor decision to another would not do. On a positive note, you and your sisters are safe from a possible alliance with the gentleman, Mr. Darcy offered. On a less than positive note, my mother will be livid, knowing that Charlotte will one day be the mistress of Longbourn, Elizabeth countered. She will no doubt blame me for that particular turn of events until her dying day. Are you saying your mother disapproved of your decision to reject Mr. Collins's hand?
That is putting it mildly, sir. I shall forever be her greatest disappointment because of it. I am sorry to hear you say that. But what of your father? Does he share your mother's disapproval? Oh, no. No two people can be farther apart in that regard. A cold breeze started brewing, prompting Elizabeth to tighten her spencer about herself. She had the foresight to remember to don a warm bonnet and gloves before leaving the house, but her attire overall still proved wanting. She shivered. Seeing her discomfort, Mr. Darcy removed his scarf from around his neck and, without asking for permission, draped it around Elizabeth's neck. It appears your father is very wise indeed, he continued, as though such a tender act of kindness was as natural as the sunrise dispelling the night's darkness or the sunset welcoming its return. No doubt he realized such an alliance would cause someone of your temperament to suffer from misery of the acutest kind. I know that was my first thought when I learned Mr. Collins had planned to marry one of the Bennet daughters. I was alarmed thinking you were his choice. I thought it was Bingley's fear that Jane was Mr. Collins's choice that brought you two to Longbourn that day. That was Bingley's purpose, for certain. As for myself, I confess that my thoughts of you were my sole motivation. Chapter 6. A couple of days later, the two couples were approaching the house in which Elizabeth's aunt Mrs. Phillips lived. She hoped against hope that their presence in the vicinity would go unnoticed, but, alas, it did not. Lydia, upon seeing her sisters walking with the gentleman from Netherfield, called out to them on the street below. "Jane! Lizzie!" she shouted. "You must come up and say hello to our aunt. She knows you have walked to town many times without calling on her. You had better come up and say hello." How Elizabeth wished she had the power to make the four of them invisible. Then she might have escaped the discomforting fate which awaited her. If Mr. Darcy thought her mother was uncouth, he must surely suffer Mrs. Phillips' vulgarity as a great tax on his forbearance. Why Elizabeth felt it was her place to shield the gentleman from her aunt, she did not know. She could no longer use the excuse of wanting to do it for Jane's sake. Jane's beau's good humour merely encouraged her aunt's worst instincts. As Elizabeth was sure her mother had thoroughly poisoned Mrs. Phillips' opinion of Mr. Darcy, her aunt had no reason for constraining her baser nature when in his presence. Reconciling herself to the inevitable, Elizabeth walked with her party up the stairs. The best she could do for the duration of their time in her aunt's apartment was smile and nod and hold her tongue, much in the same elegant manner as Jane, and pray her suffering would soon come to an end. The following days brought much of the same by way of Mr. Bingley's slow and steady courtship of Jane. The weather might vary from balmy autumn air to brisk autumn breezes. Their paths might change as well. The lovers could not always be walking to Meryton and Oakham Mount, after all. The countryside offered any number of pleasurable diversions. Netherfield Park was also a favourite, but never did they enter the manor house. The last thing Bingley needed was to be harassed by his sisters for spending all his time with Jane. Mr. Darcy was not too keen on the idea of being in Bingley's sister's company either. Caroline, when she was not chasing him around the drawing-room in heated pursuit, was teasing him mercilessly about a particular pair of fine eyes. And when she was not doing that, she was disparaging the Bennets and chastising Darcy for not doing everything in his power to put an end to her brother's madness. Time passed, as it usually did, and it was plain for all to see that Mr. Bingley was courting Jane most ardently. For all intents and purposes, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy were ostensibly acting in service to the two lovers as chaperones. But the more time they spent in each other's company, the more it seemed as though something more existed between Darcy and Elizabeth. If asked, neither of them would concede it, but when Mr. Bingley's business in town could no longer be postponed, and he and Mr. Darcy went away for a week, it was hard to discern which of the two eldest Bennet sisters was more excited when the gentleman returned. Jane would say she was the more excited of the two, and of course, Elizabeth would second the emotion. But what of her heart? Chapter 7. The next week opened a new scene in Hertfordshire. Finally, Mrs. Bennet had successfully prevailed on Bingley to take a family dinner at Longbourn. Bingley had insisted that his friend Darcy must accompany him, and Mrs. Bennet had no choice but to concede and extend the invitation to Darcy as a means of staying in Bingley's good graces. One thing was clear to Darcy. Mrs. Bennet appeared to be oblivious to how much he enjoyed spending time in Elizabeth's company. All the lady's thinly veiled contrivances were meant solely to allow Bingley to court her eldest daughter. She viewed Darcy himself as a useful inconvenience, someone to distract until Bingley did what she expected him to do. That forcing her second eldest daughter to divert his friend gave the lady a sense of revenge served Darcy's purposes very well. If feigning indifference to Elizabeth when in her mother's company was what it took for Mrs. Bennet to keep forcing her daughter to spend time with him, who was he to deprive the lady of such a scheme? Elizabeth knows better. She has to, he reasoned. Nothing else really matters. Mr. Darcy could not quite discern who was more excited about that evening's dinner party at Longbourn, his friend Bingley or Mrs. Bennet. Secretly, he too looked forward to the evening's festivities. What Darcy did not like about being in such frequent company with the Bennet family was always hearing the younger girls go on and on about the officers from the local militia in general, and George Wickham in particular. Having learned that some officers would be included among the evening's guests, he could only hope that Wickham would not be one of them. The idea of socializing with the likes of him was entirely unfathomable. Indeed, he would not do it. Little did he know his resolve was to be tested the instant he and Bingley walked into the room where the family and guests were assembled. There was George Wickham, standing by the fireplace, looking entirely too pleased with himself. When the gentlemen's eyes met, one smirked and the other glared. "Wickham," Darcy demanded, his voice reaching across the crowded room, "accompany me outside." Bingley had taken a seat by Jane's side, but in hearing his friend call Wickham out, rose to his feet. "I shall accompany you as well." "That will not be necessary," was Darcy's response to his friend. Standing straight and tall, Wickham adjusted his sleeves, tugged at his scarlet coat, nodded, and headed toward the door. Mr. Darcy was directly on his former friend's heels. "My patience where you are concerned has worn thin. I will no longer tolerate your presence and your easy manner of ingratiating yourself with the unsuspecting people of Meryton," Darcy declared, once the two of them were alone. "Well, if you are as weary of my presence as you suggest, I posit you ought to be the one to leave. Nothing is keeping you here so far as I can tell, and I know with certainty no one would miss you when you are gone. No one can stand the sight of you, whereas I am welcomed wherever I go." "We both know you have always been blessed with such happy manners as you are sure to make friends wherever you go. We both also know how unsuccessful you are in keeping them once your true character is revealed." "If you mean to paint me as a scoundrel for persuading Georgiana to elope with me, be my guest. We both know she and I would be man and wife by now if it were not for your interference." Unfortunately, Wickham had spoken nothing but the truth. Darcy's young sister, Georgiana, whose affectionate heart had retained a strong impression of Wickham's kindness to her as a child, had been persuaded to believe herself in love and to consent to an elopement. Darcy had arrived at Ramsgate in time to save his only sister from a lifetime of despair. How distressing that the gentlemen's paths had crossed once again, particularly at such a joyful time of year, a time of the year wrought with nostalgia and anticipation and other such sentimentalities. How ironic that some of Darcy's most cherished memories of Christmases of yore were forged in George Wickham's company. As his late father's most beloved godson, Wickham had been reared as though he bore the Darcy name. The cutting of the Yule log on Christmas Eve, the exchange of presents, the attendance at church early Christmas morn, these were but a few of Pemberley's traditions in which Wickham had taken part. Wickham and Darcy were once like brothers. As in any family, the two did not always get along, but the things that united them during their youths were as significant as those which separated them as two grown men. "What a shame Wickham turned out so badly. As wicked and as wretched a person as I have ever known." The other man grimaced. "I believe that speaks more to your sister's values, or lack thereof, than it does about mine. I can imagine she still pines away night and day for me," he taunted, his voice menacing. Years of history and indeed practice had taught that vile man precisely what to say to provoke his former friend. This time, Darcy was not going to take the bait. "I have no need to draw my sister's name into this. I have far better means of dealing with you, one in particular that I have been planning for some time, ever since I tossed you out of Pemberley all those years ago." Not only had Darcy tossed Wickham out of his home, but he had also forbidden him ever to darken Pemberley's door again. Darcy began listing the places George Wickham had been and all the debts he had amassed along the way. There were more than a few haberdashers in London as well as in Bath who had been shortchanged. The gambling debts were too numerous to recite. Even dead-beating houses of ill repute was not beneath George Wickham. Concluding his argument, Darcy said, "There are no free rides, Wickham. Have you never wondered why your countless debtors have not sought retribution against you?" Darcy approached his adversary directly. "I am your master. I hold your debt, which makes me the last man in the world you would wish to cross. I have been amassing your unpaid debts for years, and unless you are prepared to pay me, I may send you to jail for a long, long time whenever I decide it suits my purposes." Wickham cowered. Standing firm, Darcy persisted. "It is up to you to decide how to proceed. Abandon your commission or whatever, it makes no difference to me, but I warn you to never show your face here at Longbourn again. Better still, do not let me hear of your coming within 100 yards of either the Bennet daughters, for I will then know how to act." "What are these people to you? You have never done anything that did not redound to your own benefit," Wickham spat. "Aside from the fact that my friend Bingley is courting the eldest Bennet daughter, you ought to know that there is nothing I would not do to protect those who mean the most to me." Mr. Darcy waved his hand dismissively. "Now be gone with you. I have wasted enough of my time and energy on you to last a lifetime." Mr. Darcy returned to the house alone. He went directly to the empty seat next to Elizabeth and sat. When she could, she leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Do I even need to ask what that was about?" "I would rather you did not. Pray, you understand." "Far be it from me to question any motives of yours, sir." Elizabeth, indeed, had every reason not to question Mr. Darcy's behaviour. Before he had left Hertfordshire, Darcy had confided in Elizabeth the reason he was not inclined to bring his sister to Hertfordshire even if she were available, which she was not owing to a prior commitment to spend Christmas in Bath with friends. His reasoning had everything to do with George Wickham's being in Hertfordshire. In lengthy detail, he had told her all the reasons for his intolerance toward Wickham. That Wickham had refused the living in Kimpton, bequeathed to him by the late Mr. Darcy in his will, long before it became available, knowing that he was not fit for the clergy. That Wickham had requested money instead, in the sum of £3,000. That he had squandered all the money that Darcy had paid him in lieu of the living, and later returned to Pemberley demanding more, at which point Darcy refused him and banished him from Pemberley forever, owing to Wickham's vitriolic reaction upon being denied. And worst of all, that Wickham had left young Miss Georgiana Darcy devastated after following her to Ramsgate the summer before, persuading her to marry him and then abandoning her when it was made clear to him that he would never see a single shilling of her fortune of £30,000. How appalling that he had sunken so low as to try and elope with a young girl of 15, nearly half his age, out of greed and spite. Elizabeth wished she never had to lay eyes on him again. Of course, Mr. Darcy had confided all of this to Elizabeth in secrecy. He had learned to trust her that much. As much as she might have been tempted to enlighten anyone else, it simply was not Elizabeth's story to tell. Lydia would not be silenced in the wake of the lieutenant's disappearance. Standing by the window, peering outside, she cried, "What did you do to Mr. Wickham? He is leaving!" Tearing herself away, she headed for the door. "I must go after him and tell him that he is always welcome here." "You shall do no such thing," said Mr. Bennet, entering the room as his daughter was finishing her speech. "Now, return to your seat at once and comport yourself as a young lady ought to comport herself." Chapter 8. Beaconwood Hall, Hertfordshire, England. "How is the white soup preparation coming along?" A landowner and easily one of the wealthiest gentlemen in the country, Mr. Ashton Carter was well respected among his many acquaintances. He had married young to the love of his life, and she had given birth to 3 children, all girls, their present ages ranging from 5 to 13. "All is progressing according to schedule, brother. As soon as cook has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards," replied his younger sister, Miss Amanda Carter, who lived with him and presided over his table. Ah, speaking of that, it goes without saying that every family in our society with a single daughter between the ages of 8 and 10 and 8 and 20 is to be included on the guest list.
Does that include the Lucases?
I do not know why it would not.
I understand their oldest is recently engaged, his sister asserted.
Surprised in hearing this, Mr. Carter asked, Miss Charlotte Lucas is engaged? Who is the lucky man? I do not imagine he is from these parts.
No, he's not. The gentleman's name is Mr. William Collins. He is currently residing in Kent. He is a vicar.
What brought him to this part of the country, pray tell?
Brother, where have you been? Did you not hear that the heir to the Longbourn estate arrived in Hertfordshire a month or so ago, intending to choose a wife from among his fair cousins, one of the 5 Bennet daughters? Mr. Collins is said person.
But you just said he is to marry Miss Lucas.
That is because the Bennet daughter of his choice would not have him.
That does not sound like something Miss Bennet would tolerate. I may not know all the details of the day-to-day lives of our neighbours, but I know enough to appreciate that the business of her life is marrying off her daughters. What a shame that she has yet to meet with any success.
That is because, despite her daughter's reported beauty, they are all severely wanting in accomplishments, and they have no dowries to speak of.
Now, sister, not everyone can be blessed with a dowry as generous as yours. Not everyone can have the benefit of the masters or be educated in the finest private seminaries. At nearly 26, Miss Carter was becoming a spinster in her own right. She had used the excuse of caring for her widowed older brother as her reason for being there. She arrived just days after his dearly beloved's wife passing. That had been 5 years ago. Weeks turned quickly into months, which turned just as quickly into years. The time had come for both of them to make changes in their lives. I understand Mrs. Bennet did the best she could as both mother and governess to 5 daughters, said Mr. Carter. His sister merely shrugged.
I suppose that must be their justification, but it hardly explains the lack of decorum so often displayed by the younger girls. To be fair, I must excuse the 2 eldest from such censure. Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth are indeed the exceptions.
That is indeed the way I have always recalled the 2 of them being spoken of. It shall be a pleasure to have them here as we celebrate the start of the Christmas season.
No doubt, she quipped.
Now, what is that tone meant to suggest?
Well, you are mindful of what your having a ball now, after all these years, must signify in the hearts and minds of all our neighbours, are you not? You have not exactly been putting yourself forth.
I dare not deny the validity of such speculations. I find myself a man on what many would consider the wrong side of 35, alone in this world with 3 daughters and no sons to carry on my name. I need a proper heir. What he wanted more than anything was a son to carry on the Carter name, and now was the time to endeavour to make his favourite wish come true. He had mourned his beloved wife long enough. No sooner than Mr. Carter finished his speech, a little girl came bouncing into the room. She climbed into his lap.
Father, is it true? Is it true? Are you having a Christmas ball?
Before awaiting a response, she asked,
Oh, may I come? I won't be any trouble, I promise.
Good heavens, you know I am a staunch believer that children ought not to be seen or heard, he said, half jesting, half serious.
Oh, Father, we never have any fun,
she cried, pouting her lips. She reminded him so much of his wife when she went on that way, the sweetest woman he had ever met. Until that day, he did not know what he had done to deserve her. The best wife, the best friend, the best woman whom he had ever known. Was there any reason he had remained alone for so long as he had? Very well, my child. You may be allowed to watch the festivities from the balcony so long as you remain out of sight. He helped his youngest to her feet. Now, run along, child, and stay away from below stairs. Cook is very busy. When the adults were alone once again, Miss Carter said,
Between the Longs, the Greens, the Kings, the Bennets, I might very well go on and on, but my point is that you will not likely be disappointed. That is to say, unless you decide to set your cap on Miss Jane Bennet, for if that is the case, you are certain to be disappointed. Why is that? Do you mean to say her having rejected Mr. Collins will make her just as likely to reject me? I would like to think a man of my standing in the world might prove far more tempting than a mere vicar from a faraway parish. Oh, I never said it was Miss Jane Bennet who rejected Mr. Collins's hand in marriage. She is not the Bennet daughter with whom he meant to spend his life.
She is the eldest. Why would he have not chosen her?
It appears Mrs. Bennet is bent on saving her eldest daughter for Mr. Charles Bingley. Surely you recall having met him. He let Netherfield Park just after Michaelmas.
Mr. Carter nodded, which was sufficient encouragement for his sister to continue.
It was the second eldest daughter, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, who rejected Mr. Collins, thereby sending him straight into the arms of her neighbour, Miss Lucas.
Well, that is interesting indeed, he said, rubbing his chin. I must say, I am most eager to stand opposite the young woman who would deny the expectations of her family as Miss Elizabeth has done. She must really be something. Chapter 9. Mr. Bennet and his 3 youngest daughters were gathered around the parlour when Mrs. Bennet hurried into the room and they heard her exclaim,
"There is to be a ball at Beaconwood Hall! A Christmas ball!" "How wonderful!"
the youngest one of them all shouted. "Lydia!" Mr. Bennet said, desiring to temper her wild animal spirits.
"Indeed, for you know, Mr. Carter never celebrates anything anymore, but if what I have heard is true, and I suspect it is, there can be only one reason for his doing so now,"
she said, directing her speech to her husband. "And what is that, my dear?"
"Why, he means to find a wife. It has been 5 years since his wife's passing, and you know he needs someone to help him raise all those daughters. No one knows better than me what a trial that must be."
"Is his sister, Miss Carter, no longer up to the job?"
"For heaven's sake, Mr. Bennet, his sister cannot always be expected to sacrifice her own future for the sake of his. She must be in want of a husband and a family of her own. You know she has a dowry of £20,000. Thank heaven she is not nearly so beautiful as our Jane, else I might have some cause for concern. But as for Mr. Carter, this must surely be a cause for joy for our other girls."
"How so?" Mr. Bennet asked.
"Why, he must marry one of them, of course."
"Of course," he repeated. "Is that not the mission of every single man who comes within a mile of our daughters? Do you have a particular one in mind?"
"I most certainly do, and I am certain you will not like my choice one bit. But be that as it may, I am determined to have my way."
"Well, by all means, do not keep me in suspense."
"I intend for him to marry your little Lizzie. Now, what say you to that, Mr. Bennet?"
As though entirely unaffected, he asked, "Do you mean to say you would deprive Mr. Darcy of his favourite walking companion?"
"Mr. Darcy! I dare say that is all the proud Mr. Darcy sees in her, for she has always been an excellent walker. If I have said it once, I have said it 1,000 times. A man like that will never marry Lizzie."
Her husband peered over his spectacles. "I do not recall having heard you espouse such a sentiment."
"That does not mean I have never said it. I say it to myself all the time."
Mrs. Bennet scoffed.
"Mr. Darcy, indeed. Better that we find some other way to get rid of Lizzie, that obstinate, headstrong girl."
Even if she had not given her mother an easy excuse to disparage her, Elizabeth was the least dear to Mrs. Bennet of all her children.
"And do not dare say that you mean to oppose me," Mrs. Bennet continued. "Jane is as good as engaged to Mr. Bingley, and as Lizzie is next to her in age as well as in beauty, she is the only choice. We must put forth the one daughter who is most likely to win out among the rest of the single ladies who will be thrown into Mr. Carter's path by eager mammas in want of a rich son-in-law. You know how everyone always says Lizzie is the brightest jewel in the country. Besides, Mr. Carter, in spite of how rich he may be, is far too old for Lydia, even if she is taller than her sisters, and she will one day make some fortunate man an excellent wife."
Mr. Bennet scoffed. "The last part is debatable, but I can see why the point would be lost on you."
"Indeed, this matter is not up for debate. Besides, being courted by Mr. Carter will be the perfect way for Lizzie to make amends for the harm she inflicted on our family when she rejected the hand of a perfectly good man and subjected us all to ridicule and censure."
"I am certain consequences have not been as dire as that." His lady huffed.
"How would you even know, Mr. Bennet? How often have you ventured far away from the solitude of your library to know what anyone is thinking and saying? No, it must be her, and that is that."
"What is that?" Elizabeth asked upon walking into the room.
"Lizzie, we have such excellent news," exclaimed Kitty. "We have all been invited to a Christmas ball at Beaconwood Hall. Mr. Carter is rumoured to be looking for a wife. Guess which one of us Mamma plans for him to choose?" "She means for him to pick you!" Lydia shouted.
Elizabeth coloured. Her heart skipped a beat. What? 3 miles away, talk of the upcoming ball was also underway.
It appears one of your neighbours has decided to follow your example, Charles.
What are you talking about, Caroline?
Why, I am speaking of the upcoming Christmas ball at Beaconwood Hall.
I am sure Mr. Carter's reason for giving a ball has nothing to do with me.
Indeed, Louisa cried. It is being said that the gentleman is in want of a wife. I have heard it has been 5 years since his late wife, Mrs. Carter, passed away. After so many years alone, I say it is about time.
She looked at her sister knowingly. This may be your lucky day.
That old man! Caroline exclaimed. Heaven forbid! You know very well I have in mind another prospect for myself, she said, eyeing Mr. Darcy, who was sitting by the fire, reading.
Her speech, it seemed, was to no avail. The gentleman did not look up from his book. Caroline raised her voice a little.
I am certain this must satisfy Mrs. Bennet's favourite Christmas wish, however.
How do you suppose? Louisa asked.
Why, she will have another chance to get rid of one of her daughters.
Now Caroline really had Mr. Darcy's attention. Closing his book, he stood and walked over to the nearest window. I posit the occasion of a ball will satisfy most everyone's favourite Christmas wish. Who does not enjoy a ball? Asked Bingley.
What say you, Mr. Darcy? Is the idea of attending a country ball on your Christmas wish list?
I think you know how I view the idea of balls in general, regardless of whether they take place in the country or in town, during the spring, summer, autumn, or winter.
Then I do not suppose you will be attending the Beaconwood ball. That is to say, unless the prospect of a pair of fine eyes poses too much temptation for you to stay away.
There is nothing like the great pleasure of a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman to weaken a man's resolve.
And to think you said that out loud, Caroline smirked. It must be all those long walks of late that have heightened your particular regard. No doubt you will reserve the opening set for your lady. However, I do hope you will have mercy on my sister and me by allowing us to stand opposite you as well.
As much as I hate to suspend your pleasure, I am not planning to attend the Beaconwood ball.
Oh, does that mean you plan to return to town? Or do you mean to go to Pemberley, perhaps?
I'm going to London, Mr. Darcy replied. She turned to her brother.
What say we all return to town? Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. Christmas is almost upon us. I can think of no better place to enjoy all the gaieties which that season generally brings.
Bingley steeled his voice. Caroline, you are welcome to go any time you wish. I have personal affairs which demand I stay here in Hertfordshire.
Whatever they are, Charles, surely they can wait.
No, my affairs cannot wait.
Mr. Darcy, will you please prevail on my brother to be sensible? You know he will listen to you. He always does.
Charles is his own man. I dare not interfere.
Do you mean to say you plan to leave him here to fend for himself against those Bennets while you go on about your merry way? You are abandoning my brother.
I am not abandoning anyone. I have every intention of returning once my business in town is concluded. Indeed, I mean to spend Christmas here in Hertfordshire.
Chapter 10.
Nobody enjoyed a ball more than Elizabeth, even if she did not express her jubilation over the prospect of dancing the night away as eagerly as did her younger sisters Kitty and Lydia. But how was any pleasure at all to be had, knowing her own mother would be doing everything in her power to dash Elizabeth's every prospect for gaiety? She told her sister Jane as much while they were preparing for the much-anticipated event.
Jane, I fear my life as I know it is over.
Come now, Lizzie, it can't possibly be as bad as that. To Elizabeth's way of thinking, it was, indeed, as bad as that. Making matters worse, her new friend Mr. Darcy would not be in attendance, which meant there was a chance that George Wickham might also decide to show his face. Neither of these concerns she felt free to discuss with Jane, for it would have meant divulging secrets she could not comfortably share.
How can you make light of my pain? Elizabeth cried instead.
I know you well enough to know you will do nothing you do not want to do. What difference does it make that Mamma has her heart set on an alliance between you and Mr. Carter? Why might she have more success now than she had when trying to force you to accept Mr. Collins?
Mr. Collins is no Mr. Carter.
That is putting it mildly. Mr. Carter is wealthy, and I dare say he has managed to maintain a certain air which belies his years.
Whose side are you on, Jane?
Your side, Lizzie. I'm just saying that a woman could do far worse than marry such a man.
That is very easy to say for someone who is, for all intents and purposes, beyond his reach. I dare say Mamma would kill anyone who thought to come between you and your Mr. Bingley. As for me, she would rather allow a pack of wolves to carry me off than allow me to marry a man of my own choosing. No, she is determined I will marry Mr. Carter, and heaven help anyone who dares to stand in her way.
Again, I am sure it will not come to that. Papa will not abide by it.
Perhaps, had I not rejected Mr. Collins mere weeks ago, you would be correct, but I can have no reason to suspect Papa will side with me against my mother a second time.
Then what do you intend to do? Elizabeth had given that very question considerable thought.
For one, I shall do everything in my power to avoid Mr. Carter. I shall be in no danger from our mother's shenanigans so long as the gentleman and I are never in proximity.
I suppose that's a good start. But what happens if, despite your best efforts, you and Mr. Carter are prevailed on to come face to face? What will you do?
I suppose I shall make a great effort to throw him in someone else's way, said Elizabeth, her spirits rising to playfulness. I'm very good at that, you know.
I have been told, said Jane with a bit of liveliness on her own part. By the by, I understand Mr. Bingley's sister Caroline is in want of a single gentleman of a large fortune so that she might be the mistress of a grand estate.
Why, Jane!
Elizabeth exclaimed upon listening to this.
That is the most unforgiving speech that I have ever heard you utter. Good girl.
Elizabeth's fears began to unfold almost the instant they entered Beaconwood Hall. The entire house was awash in a warm glowing light from the abundance of chandeliers. Everything Elizabeth saw was splendid. There she stood in wretched suspense in the receiving line with her family, being greeted by Mr. Carter and his sister. Elizabeth was almost tempted to look the gentleman straight in the eye as her mother went on and on about what a pleasure it was to be welcomed into his lovely home on such a festive occasion. Mrs. Bennet held up the line as she presented each one of her daughters in their turn, saving Elizabeth for last.
And here is our beautiful Elizabeth, she said. You, no doubt, will recall having heard of her, for she is fondly spoken of as being the brightest jewel in the country.
Mr. Carter took Elizabeth's hand in his, a courtesy he had extended to none of the young ladies before her, no less, and bowed slightly. It is my pleasure to have you here, Miss Elizabeth. I must say your reputation precedes you. No doubt no finer commendation can be bestowed. Pray, you will save a place on your dance card for me? Here Elizabeth allowed her eyes to meet his. She did not expect the gentleman before her to be so charming. Neither did she expect him to be so handsome for someone on the wrong side of 35. Such a fine figure of a man, whose comportment indeed belied his age. What a shame she had to lie to him, for she had vowed to spend the better part of the evening avoiding his proximity. She then supposed one set would not hurt anything. He was, after all, the evening's host.
It will be my pleasure, sir, she said, curtsying.
You will not regret dancing with her one bit, sir,
Mrs. Bennet cried as Mr. Bennet took her arm in his and began coaxing her along.
My daughter is an excellent dancer,
she exclaimed as she was being hurried away. Hours later, Elizabeth was returning from her third or fourth trip to the retiring room on the way to the ballroom when a voice could be heard asking,
Who are you?
Startled, Elizabeth turned in the direction of the voice. She espied the most amazing little creature her eyes had beheld all evening. The child's adorable big brown eyes, how they twinkled! Her dimples, her cheeks, how they reminded Elizabeth of her little cousins from town.
I am Miss Elizabeth Bennet, she said cheerily, kneeling before the young one. And who might you be?
I live here.
Oh, you do. Something tells me you ought to be nestled in bed.
But I'm not tired. Will you read me a story, please?
Where is your governess?
She is at the ball, I think. So is my aunt. She takes care of us too. My father said I couldn't go because children are not meant to be seen or heard.
Elizabeth placed her hand on her mouth to hide her smile.
Oh, I'm sure he did not say that.
Yes, she cried, nodding her head. He really did. And now that you have seen me, I'm going to be in big trouble.
What say you that my seeing you remain a secret? Would that make you feel better?
I think so, but I'd feel even better if you will read to me.
Elizabeth laughed a little. I see no harm in that, but it must be a very short story, else someone is bound to come looking for me, and then my seeing you will not be a secret. The child's expression fell.
I do not know any short stories.
As quickly as that, she smiled.
Will you read me a poem instead, or sing me a carol? Do you like carols? I love carols.
Indeed. If I agree to indulge you in your request, will you promise to go straight to bed afterward? She nodded. Taking the young girl by her tiny hand, Elizabeth led her to a nearby seat where they both settled comfortably. Mind you, young lady, I am more in tune with the melody of this song than I am with the words. This shall be a much more pleasurable experience for both of us if I hum this particular carol to you instead. How does that sound? The little girl clasped her hands together. Her bright smile was sufficient encouragement for Elizabeth to proceed. Clearing her throat, Elizabeth hummed the first stanza of Nos Galan, a Welsh carol that her sister Mary had spent a prodigious amount of time practicing of late in preparation for her exhibition at Longbourn on Christmas Eve. Much to Elizabeth's delight, her new acquaintance hummed the next stanza perfectly in key. How lovely, Elizabeth said. She could not resist giving the little girl a hug. Have you committed Nos Galan to memory? She asked. The child's countenance clouded.
What did you say?
What I meant to ask is, how do you know this carol?
Oh, my father likes to hum it to my sisters and me at Christmas time too.
Elizabeth chuckled. That sounds lovely. Your father sounds like a very nice man.
He is. He is the best man in the whole wide world,
the little one declared, outstretching her arms as far as she could. Very well. Shall we continue? Elizabeth asked. Her little companion nodded, and their humming recommenced, this time in unison. Soon enough, their attentions were drawn by the sound of a man clearing his throat. Just as suddenly as that, the little girl bolted from the chair, and before Elizabeth even knew what she was about, she had disappeared down the hallway. Elizabeth arose to her seat. Sir, she cried, I take full responsibility for what just unfolded. A twist of the tall gentleman's head gave Elizabeth to know she had nothing to dread. How generous of you, Miss Elizabeth. However, knowing my darling child as well as I do, I suspect she deserves her own share of the credit. Smiling, Elizabeth nodded. She is adorable. Pray, what is her name? It is Amanda, in honour of her mother, my late wife. Elizabeth recalled Mr. Carter's wife had died during childbirth. It struck her that the child was little Amanda. Sir, I am sorry for your loss. I thank you for the sentiment. It cannot have been easy for you, all these years, she said, her voice trailing off toward the end of her speech. You are very kind. Little Amanda rarely takes to strangers. Even she can attest to your good heart. The silence which ensued was, in every way, uncomfortable for Elizabeth. If you will excuse me, sir, I ought to be returning to the ballroom. May I have a moment of your time, Miss Elizabeth? There is a matter I wish to discuss with you. That is to say, if you will allow it. Elizabeth threw a quick glance at her surroundings. Here, sir? She asked, her voice cracking. He nodded. Pray, have a seat, he said. He took the seat opposite the one he offered Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth, he began, now seated across from her, I do not believe I am mistaken when I say that you have been avoiding me all night. Sir, she began. Pray, hear me out. I was honoured to have you stand opposite me earlier, but it was clear to me that you took no pleasure in doing so. You scarcely spoke 2 words to me, which was a stark contrast to your behaviour with other partners. Elizabeth could have no doubt to whom Mr. Carter was referring. She had been so delighted to see Mr. Darcy when he arrived at the ball on the heels of his return from London, surprising everyone, including the entire Netherfield party. It was all she could do not to talk to him throughout the entirety of their set. There was too much to be discussed for silence to exist between them. Sir, I did not mean to give offence. It is just that... He interrupted her once again. I suffered no offence. I believe, were I in your position, I might very well have behaved similarly. You see, it has not escaped my notice that your mother, Mrs. Bennet, is a woman on a mission this evening. I believe there is a great deal of speculation on my purposes for this evening's festivities. Your mother is not the only one in attendance entertaining hopes of a possible, shall I say, advantageous match for her family. Hearing this, Elizabeth was beginning to suspect she had been too harsh in her opinion of Mr. Carter. Here was an honourable man, a respectable man, a good man, and one deserving of her esteem. He is most certainly not meant to be disparaged or dreaded. "I'm so sorry," she said. "No, you need not apologise to me. I fear I ought to be the one to apologise to you, for setting in place a set of circumstances that has landed you in such a position. I do not know about you, Miss Elizabeth, but I am foolish enough to aspire to a love match, even with 3 children as part of the package. I suspect you, likewise, aspire to marry for love. So fear not, for you are in no danger from me. Not that I do not believe I would be most fortunate to have you. I believe the marital felicity we both desire for ourselves lies elsewhere." Standing, Mr. Carter offered his hand to Elizabeth and aided her to her feet. "Now, return to the ball and enjoy your fair share of fun. Pay no attention to your mother's antics and focus instead on that which is directly in front of you, for I believe the felicity you deserve is closer to you than anyone in attendance this evening might otherwise suspect." Later that evening, at supper, a troubling sense of having found herself in a similar position as before was too much for Elizabeth to bear. There sat Mrs. Bennet seated next to Lady Lucas, going on and on about the prospect of an upcoming wedding. Only this time, she was not talking about Jane and Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. No, this time Mrs. Bennet was boasting of Elizabeth, and Mr. Carter, and Beaconwood Hall. Once again, to Elizabeth's inexpressible vexation, she could perceive that the chief of her mother's ramblings and premature speculations were overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them. Her mortification was now complete. She made no attempt to silence her mother. What would have been the point? Her mother was beyond the pale. Bolting from her chair, and nearly toppling her glass of wine in the process, Elizabeth hurried away. Even the cold air was a welcome reprieve from the goings-on at the supper table. She was shivering outside in the cold when Mr. Darcy found her, standing alone on the balcony, staring up at the starry night sky. Without hesitation, he removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Even if she wanted to object, she could not. She welcomed the warmth his finely tailored garment afforded. In such a case like this, it was more comforting than an embrace. Elizabeth had not realized how cold she was. She was not even wearing her gloves, such had been her haste in fleeing the room. She clung tighter to Mr. Darcy's coat. "How can I make amends for my mother's speech?" Darcy said. "How many times do I have to tell you that I do not hold you accountable for the opinions of your mother, of any of your relations for that matter, not even your father's? I know you will behave in accordance with your own best interests, just as you did with Mr. Collins. Having earned my good opinion long ago, there is nothing you might do or say to lose it. Whatever decision you make, I will respect you for it." It warmed Elizabeth's heart to hear Mr. Darcy speak that way. "It is cold out here," she said. Yes, I know," was his reply. "Shall I accompany you inside? I would like nothing more than to enjoy a second set with you." "2 sets in one evening, sir. What will people think?" "Do we really care, Miss Elizabeth?" Removing Mr. Darcy's coat, she handed it back to him. During such times as this, Elizabeth had to ask herself what she would do without Mr. Darcy. Smiling, she said, "I suppose you have a point." Chapter 11. Longbourn, the 24th of December. Mrs. Bennet was running around the house, making sure everyone was enjoying the gaieties that Christmas Eve was meant to afford. What a blessing it was to be surrounded by all the people who meant the most to her. Her brother and sister, Edward and Madeline Gardiner, had arrived from town the day before, just as they always did at that time of year. Her sister, Mrs. Agatha Phillips, was present along with her husband, Mr. John Phillips. Aside from her immediate family, several other families could be counted among the guests that evening. Despite Mr. Collins's being the closest thing to family on Mr. Bennet's side, in proximity even if not in blood, luckily he had seen fit to spend the evening with his soon-to-be in-laws at nearby Lucas Lodge. This was good riddance so far as Mrs. Bennet was concerned, for she would never truly forgive Charlotte Lucas for stealing Longbourn's heir away from Elizabeth before her headstrong daughter had time to come to her senses and agree to have him for herself. Mrs. Bennet continued to receive the Lucases in her home, in spite of such a betrayal, but not that evening. Not to be forgotten was her favourite guest of all, the handsome and charming Mr. Bingley. His sisters had returned to town by then along with his brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, but not Mr. Darcy. For reasons Mrs. Bennet could not quite explain, he still remained in Hertfordshire. Fortunately, Mrs. Bennet had grown quite accustomed to seeing the gentleman, and she had even gone out of her way to see that his favourite dishes were included in the menu whenever the gentleman and Mr. Bingley dined at Longbourn. That alone was reason enough for Mrs. Bennet to wish for a speedy wedding. She was not one to worry about finances, but even she could not be immune to the cost of regularly feeding two wealthy gentlemen. When she saw Elizabeth standing alone, admiring the splendour of the evening as it unfolded, she rushed to her side.
Lizzie, why are you just standing there looking stupid? You know you are meant to keep Mr. Darcy out of Mr. Bingley's way. I have a strong suspicion that tonight is finally the night that Mr. Bingley proposes to our Jane. The last thing we need is for Mr. Darcy to get in the way. Now run along and find him and do everything in your power to keep him distracted. That is the least you can do after throwing Mr. Collins into Charlotte Lucas's path.
Mother, I do wish you would allow things to progress according to their own pace where Jane and Mr. Bingley are concerned. What will be, will be.
That is easy for you to say, Miss Lizzie. I dare say you would be singing quite a different tune if you had 5 single daughters of your own to get rid of. Daughters with such meagre dowries, no less. Get yourself in my position, and then we might talk.
For the past couple of days, the household had been in a constant state of preparation for that evening's gaieties. Christmas Eve at Longbourn had always been joyful. If things progressed as Mrs. Bennet planned, this year's Christmas Eve would be even more so. Even as that evening's gathering got underway, Lydia was happily engaged running to and from, adding the final touches for the perfect night.
Are you not the naughty little Christmas elf going around playing matchmaker in our mother's stead by hanging mistletoe in every doorway?
Said Kitty to her sister Lydia.
Making mischief is a far more apt description of Lydia's antics, Mary declared. Single young ladies ought to guard their behaviour at all times and not yield to temptation under the guise of so-called holiday traditions.
Such was Mary's nature, always pontificating on how a young lady ought not to act. Her sister's sermons were entirely wasted on Lydia.
Be that as it may, dear Mary, I mean it to be a great success, Lydia said.
What Lydia did not say, or perhaps she did not even know, was she was doing George Wickham's bidding by conspiring to have Mr. Darcy kiss her sister Elizabeth, for Wickham had told her enough about the haughty man to assure her that Mr. Darcy would never have Elizabeth, not as his wife. The very idea would surely make the proud man miserable. What she did know was that she missed the lieutenant's company. She was sure that whatever Mr. Darcy had said to him at Longbourn that night had been the means of driving the charming officer straight into the arms of Miss Mary King, a young lady who lived nearby and who had inherited £10,000. What was more, Wickham was always crossing to the other side of the street whenever they saw him in Meryton. He never returned their greetings, and he never joined them when they were speaking with the other officers, including Mr. Denny, who had been the one who had first introduced them. If not for Mr. Darcy's interference, Lydia supposed she might have been Mr. Wickham's choice. Of course, she could have no way of knowing if her supposition was correct. She did not need to know. All she knew was that forcing Mr. Darcy to kiss the woman whom he had once proclaimed as not being handsome enough to tempt him was fitting retribution for every injustice he had ever inflicted upon poor Mr. Wickham. The prospect that she too might be the happy recipient of a bounty of kisses that evening was merely a bonus. After all, Wickham was not the only officer in Meryton. There were more than enough redcoats scattered around the house to do the job admirably. Finally, the chance to carry out her scheme against Mr. Darcy presented itself. Lydia was standing beside her sister Elizabeth, as she had made a point of doing for most of the evening whenever she could, when she espied Mr. Darcy not too far away.
"La, Mr. Darcy," she shouted, "come and stand next to Lizzie underneath the mistletoe. I bet you want to."
Lydia nudged her older sister.
I bet you want him to, too, don't you, Lizzie?
Lydia, I declare you are insufferable. You ought to be ashamed of yourself,
cried Elizabeth, easing away from the mystical weed hanging overhead.
Oh, Lizzie, you're no fun at all,
Lydia huffed.
Well, at least I tried,
said Lydia as she scooted away. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's eyes fixed on each other's, her eyes filled with contrition, his with compassion. Mr. Darcy walked to her and extended his arm. She tucked her hand inside. He then led her to the spot she had abandoned mere moments ago. For the sake of tradition, he said. Leaning forward, he kissed Elizabeth. This was their first kiss, albeit a chaste kiss. Never mind that this might very well be their only kiss. In Elizabeth's mind, it was astounding. Everything a kiss underneath the mistletoe ought to be. Elizabeth pulled away even if she did so reluctantly, and she threw a quick glance about the room. It appeared their behaviour had gone completely undetected, which was just as well, for the possibility that her mother had seen what had unfolded would surely set the wheels of her eager mind in motion toward planning a double wedding at Netherfield. The two of them were still standing underneath the mistletoe when the merry sound of cheers rang out across the hallway. Darcy and Elizabeth hurried to see what had unfolded. The vision before them was all that Elizabeth could have hoped for. There was Mr. Bingley on bended knee, holding Jane's hand in his. The smile on Jane's face said it all, and everyone gathered around was as happy as they could be. Elizabeth hurried to her sister's side, for she wanted to be among the first to wish her dearest sister joy. Upon having done so, she looked around to see how Mr. Darcy was reacting to the news. She hoped he would be as pleased as she was. From her vantage point, he was nowhere to be seen. Elizabeth excused herself from her sister's side and made her way outside, hoping that if Mr. Darcy had left, she might have time to stop him. As for what she might say when and if she found him, she had yet to decide. She only knew she needed to say something. Darcy had escaped the house, not because he was unhappy for his friend. He could not possibly deny that there was real affection between Bingley and Miss Bennet after having spent the greater part of the past several weeks in company with them. He was proud of his friend. What can be better than falling in love, regardless of the passage of time? He could no longer deny what his own feelings were toward Elizabeth either. With no knowledge of when he began feeling this way, he only knew his thoughts of Elizabeth had no ending. Mere days apart from her while he was in London had caused him to question how he wished to spend the rest of his life. Whatever his future held, he wanted to spend it with her. Darcy was in love, most ardently. Like his friend, he, too, intended to reach for that bright, shining star, his own happily ever after, as it were. He had left the house hoping that Elizabeth would notice his absence and come in search of him. Being always in the company of others had become more comfortable for him with each passing day. That night, however, if only for a quarter hour or so, he wanted Elizabeth all to himself. When she suddenly appeared before him, it was all he could do not to take her into his arms. I was hoping you would come to me.
Am I so predictable, Mr. Darcy?
After spending so much time with you these past weeks, I would like to think I have gotten to know you very well. That said, I look forward to exploring all that remains to be discovered about you.
Elizabeth shivered. It is cold out tonight.
Darcy quickly surrendered his coat and draped it about Elizabeth's shoulders. He stared into her eyes. How they twinkled, as bright as the stars above.
Will you always be offering me your coat, Mr. Darcy?
Will you always be coming out into the cold without one? He asked, his hands resting on either lapel of the warm garment. They were standing so close enough for each to feel the heat from the other's body. Still, it was not as close as Darcy wished it to be. He kissed Elizabeth's lips. She took his breath away. Much to his delight, she was kissing him back. He pressed on, the taste of pepper and mint inviting, thrilling, enticing, and oh, so exciting. The frosty nighttime air nipping at the noses did not intrude on the magic of their kiss. Only her soft moan would do. Their lips parted. Elizabeth said, Sir, Earlier we had the excuse of an advantageous placement of a sprig of mistletoe to account for our behaviour. As you can see, there is no such excuse now. That is where you are mistaken, my lady. You see, I chose to wait for you in this particular spot for a reason, he said, throwing a cursory glance to the tree limbs directly above where they were standing. Just in case you cannot make it out, there is a huge cluster of your sister's matchmaking weapon of choice hanging from this particular tree's highest bough. Elizabeth laughed a little at Mr. Darcy's stratagem. That is quite high up above, sir, and while my father may be persuaded to accept that as an excuse, I dare say you would have no such luck with my mother. Were she to discover us this way, she would insist we be married, by special license no less. What a Christmas wish that would prove to be! Pray, you are speaking of yourself in saying that, he whispered softly in Elizabeth's ear. I do so love when a Christmas wish comes true, she whispered in return. Well, if that is indeed the case, then there is only one thing to be done, he said, drawing Elizabeth closer. He placed his thumb on her chin and lifted it just so. Darcy moistened his lips, and gazing into the only bewitching eyes he ever wished to behold, he asked, My dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, shall we seal this Christmas wish come true with a kiss? Hearing his tender voice and seeing in his eyes the tacit promise of all the joyous wonders which future seasons would bring, Elizabeth surrendered herself into Mr. Darcy's arms. Moistening her lips, she closed her eyes and leaned in. This has been Christmas Sealed with a Kiss, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Christina Platt.